In the last session, we learned what is input and output device. In this session, we are going to learn about the central processing unit, the CPU. The CPU is the master chip that controls all the other parts of the computer. The CPU has several small circuits inside it. The CPUs are placed in the center of the computer so that it can control each and every circuit inside the CPU. Here, there are two different circuits shown in this image. This image has a math and logic calculator IC and another IC to send and receive commands. So these ICs are placed inside the CPU so that the CPU can perform different operations using these ICs. Now, let us check how it works. The CPU knows which circuits to use and when to use them. For example, the CPU receives a simple command that tells it which circuit to use and when to use them. These commands are obtained from the software, that is the program. For example, now we have received a command which says add two numbers. So the result will be stored in memory. For that, the CPU uses the adder circuit. Now we receive a store command, store that, so that the value obtained by calculating the two numbers is now stored in a memory unit. For that, we use a send and receive circuit. So the CPU has several circuits inside it. Several circuits are combined together in a small unit called the CPU. The CPU receives commands in the form of binary numbers, that is zeros and ones. For each command, the CPU will work according to the command. So, we can program the CPU and perform the operations. The memory unit. There are several memory units we use in our computer. It is classified as RAM, ROM, and storage units like floppy disk, hard disk, pen drives, external drives. These storage units provide information to the CPU. The storage units store the commands and the CPU receives the commands from the storage unit and work according to the commands and store the input and output obtained after processing into the memory unit. The commands are processed one by one by the CPU and the output is stored in the memory. So, there is a flow of data from the memory to the computer CPU and the CPU to the memory unit. So, the data flows to and fro from the CPU to the memory. In the olden days, the binary code was directly given as input to the computer through punched cards, which means some holes will be made in a piece of paper so that this piece of paper is given as input and the output is also received in binary form. But nowadays, things are changed. We can now program the computer in a high-level programming language that is likely to be in English. So, not just numbers. These programming languages like Python, Ruby or Blockly use simple commands that can be understood by us easily. The CPU receives commands from the user so that these commands are obtained in binary form by the programming language. So this binary language is understood by the CPU and the CPU processes these binary numbers and provides the output on the screen. Okay, now what is the idea about CPU? You can write down your ideas in your notebooks and you can show it to us through WhatsApp. Do you have ever seen inside the CPU? Let us learn what is inside the CPU in the next session.